So you've decided to start your journey into antique sword collecting. And as with all hobbies, passions, activities, the first steps are usually the toughest because you literally don't know kind of where you're looking or what to look for or where to look for it. And once you kind of get that momentum going, things get a little easier, not always in the sense that difficulties increase with your level of experience perhaps, but they do get easier. You kind of figure out your pace and what you're comfortable with. So in this video, we're going to address another topic that may be useful for beginner collectors. So we already started that in a previous video where we looked at how to find antique swords, where to find them. So we took a look at marketplaces, auction houses, their pros and cons, and these kinds of things. But the next question that may come to mind in the mind of our hypothetical beginner collector is, okay, I know where to find them and I know what to look out for, but what kind of sword should I get? What is a good beginner's sword? What is something that, let's say, has a good ratio of low barrier to entry, let's say, and high satisfaction? And the first thing I have to say here, maybe as a disclaimer, is that there is no real objective answer. So some people may be really happy with just having an antique object, whatever the condition. Some may want something that's pristine and in mint condition practically. And barrier to entry really depends on your budget, on your location and accessibility, and these kinds of topics. So keeping in mind that this is a subjective set of suggestions, what I thought I would do in this video is look into a few of what I think are the most accessible swords, or the ones that I would look into as a beginner. So low risk, high reward. What we're going to look here is at specifically kind of at three types of swords. And these I think are what I would really generally suggest. There are some honorable mentions, and which we'll also go through. And we're going to be focusing on European swords in this video. And that is not because there's any kind of qualitative difference, let's say. It's because, well, it's what I know best. So it's what I kind of feel comfortable maybe giving some kind of advice or suggestion about. But also because when we look at non-European swords, there's a big difference between the mass-produced swords in Europe, which kind of have official markings, and you know they're produced with a certain kind of standardized approach. And this makes it easier to identify historical originals from, let's say, fakes. It also, and not fakes in malicious terms, just like from newer non-antique productions. Whereas, well, there are super amazing, there's a huge variety of really, really cool swords. If you look at African swords, if you look at Southeast Asian swords, Indian swords as well, you'll find a huge variety of really amazing objects. But in my opinion, they require deeper understanding of things, because in many cases, these swords have been produced with traditional ways up to, maybe perhaps they're still being produced. That is the case, for example, of kerises in Indonesia. And it can be really hard to tell if you're buying a 19th century antique or something that was made 10 years ago. And that's not to say that the 10-year-old sword is not worth your purchase, but here we're focusing on antiques and how easy it is to kind of recognize them and buy them as a beginner. Another mention goes for Japan. Japan, of course, has also an incredibly rich market, but as far as my understanding goes, it is kind of tough to get into. It's very, very specific. It requires a lot of understanding of all the details of the sword, the history, the parts. It requires knowledge of lexicon in Japanese. So it's probably not the ideal avenue if you're starting from scratch. And before we dive into the swords, I just wanted to quickly mention the three criteria I thought I would use when determining which swords to suggest. And these are authenticity. So of course, it's a video about antique swords, and we want types of swords that we can pretty safely say are going to be actual authentic antiques versus a high risk of them being fakes, for example. The second criterion is accessibility. So they should also be swords that someone doesn't have to wait 10 years of hunting to find that specific sword. It should be something that is easily accessible, that a beginner can say, okay, I want to pull the trigger and it's there and I can get it. And speaking of accessibility, the third criterion is price point. So I want swords that are going to be not too expensive, that anyone who has decided that this is a hobby worth pursuing can afford. So we're talking about anything, I would say, below the €200, dollar, pound mark. And all these criteria connect to basically one point, which is how many of these swords were produced in the time they were actively used. And that determines really how much a sword will be accessible, cheap, and likely to be authentic. So we have, especially when we're talking about the later 19th century, swords were produced in the millions. So even today, it's more likely that you actually find an original for cheap. It might actually even be the case that a reproduction, like a battle-ready reproduction, may cost even more than an actual antique. And the first typology of swords I would like to recommend here is this. So what you see here is a Swiss briquette. But it could also be a French one, like the one you see hanging behind me. It could also be a glaive, like the one you see in the second position there. Or it could be something like this, like a fascinemesser. So what I'm talking about here basically are short sidearms with a brass hilt. These exist in a few typologies. We've seen a couple of them here. And they're swords that were assigned to different troops. So it could have been artillery, as is usually the case, I think, for these, or for the glaives. It could have been infantry, as is the case for the briquette. And they were produced in the millions. Not only this, they were produced across a whole bunch of different armies. And you can find them in all kinds of conditions. Lots of times these were not fancy, they were never really fancy officer swords, so it's likely that they haven't been often kept in the best of shape. You'll see this fascinemesser, for example, is rather, the blade is rather stained and a little corroded, but you can also get lucky and have something a little better like that one. And price points here range from literally the low 50s, if you're lucky, and maybe something is kind of in not great condition, to potentially hundreds if you're looking at something with provenance, with a scabbard, like in pristine condition. But on average, I would say with €100, $100, 150, 200, in that range, you'll really be able to pick the one you prefer. But why, apart from the price point, why are these interesting? So as I mentioned, they were produced in a whole variety of types, and a whole variety of armies adopted them. So this is actually a great kind of field to dive into for the beginner, because it's not only a sword that you're buying, but usually it has some markings. And by researching these markings, you can really develop, kind of start training your collector's eye or mindset. So for example, there are differences in this case, in this fascinemesser, the quillin, if it's like with a soft curve versus a bit of a straighter crossguard, it may determine whether your fascinemesser is from Saxony, as is this one, or is from Bavaria. Or if you're looking at a briquette, the amount of ribs on the grip may determine the period in which it was produced, or the shape of the knuckle guard. So you have a lot of research that you can do, and at a fairly low price point, this provides the maximum amount of bang for the buck, I would say. So definitely look into these. Moving on to the second suggestion, this would be moving sometimes up a little in the pricing range. We're always around the 200, but what I say here is more the minimum price changes. So while you can find a relic condition fascinemesser, as this one, for under 100 of your currency fairly easily, it may be a little, the ones I'm suggesting now may be more in the 100 to 200 and maybe a little bit up range, depending on condition again and luck. So what we're looking at here are late 19th century, not always late, but it's a mid to late 19th century sabers or swords for officers or NCOs often. These are a little bit fancier, so they might match more what your ideal of an antique sword is when you choose to collect them. And they have a lot of the advantages of the brass-hilt short sidearms I mentioned earlier, they're a little bit different in the sense that these are usually easier to research and determine. So whereas there's such a variety of sidearms of short swords that it can be hard to really do precise research, here we know that this is a French 1882, for example, and we can fairly, that's not always true. This is, for example, Adjutant 1845, 1855, but it has no markings, so it's not French. It's probably Belgian, but yeah, so it's not always true that you can identify them, but it's fairly easier to do. So again, here we have a set of swords that are produced in vast numbers. Just consider these were produced, let's say, from 1845 until they were still in use during World War I by the French army. The French ones, not this Belgian one, I guess. But so it means that there's a huge number of these floating around. And of course, this wealth of production of these swords means that the price point is usually accessible and relatively low. Of course, there's a big difference in condition. So a sword without scabbard and covered in rust will probably be really cheap and accessible. A sword that has matching scabbard, for example, and still has even maybe the scabbard protection, like the canvas scabbard cover, and it has the porte-épée, and everything is spotless, that's going to cost quite a bit. So it doesn't always mean that it's going to be a cheap sword. But on average, these kinds of swords are definitely a good suggestion, I would say, when looking to start your own collection. Now, these, of course, are French/Belgian examples, but you can find similar swords from a similar time and with similar production volumes, so with similar prices and accessibility. Also in England, you have a lot of English patterns, like Victorian patterns, that are fairly accessible. It's also true for German swords, for example, the IOD 89 Degen. I have a video about that. That's also usually fairly accessible. Another example would be, well, not perhaps this one, maybe this one goes a little bit over, but some Italian sabers as well, like the 1888, so later. And if you're looking oftentimes at really pulling the price down to its lowest, lots of times, if you look at swords, this one may be a better example, early 1900s swords, unless they're a specific model that maybe has really collector's value, you can find them for really quite cheap. And as for the third typology, I would suggest that would be in my top 3 picks for swords for beginners, would be the small sword. So this, I feel, is a little of perhaps unusual suggestion. One, because the price point here is maybe a little bit higher, still I think in the range we are looking at. And what's really interesting about these is that they enable you to access older weapons. So of course, every collector has different priorities. If you're really into specifically military objects, of course, you're probably going to focus on standard pattern or model military swords and sabers like the ones we just saw. But if you prefer the idea of having an antique piece in your home, this may be the easiest, the small sword may be the easiest way to access something from the late 18th century, for example, even mid 18th century if you're lucky. So it really depends on what your preferences are as a collector and why you're collecting swords. Now, these were also produced in huge numbers, but not for the same reasons as the military swords. The military ones were, of course, had to provide equipment for armies, so they were produced in the millions. These were produced in big numbers because they were a trendy item, I would say. So in many cases, these were, as you can see, even this fairly simple model of a small sword is beautifully decorated, although with not with any rich or fancy materials. And these were often used as a fashion piece, so they'd be on your side in your fancy dress, in your fancy late 18th century dress. Another thing is that there is a lot less clarity around these swords because these were not produced according to patterns or standards, so it can be really, like, this, what you see here is not according to any guidelines. And if you don't know what to research or how to understand what a certain thing is, you just don't know. There is no model of this kind of small sword. And this brings me to another point, which is that if you enjoy not only hanging stuff on your wall, but you also enjoy researching it, the small sword will probably require further investment from you, apart from the price, and that is an investment in time, but also in perhaps specialized literature. So unlike this, where I could say, okay, I can recognize this, once I know what it is, I know them all, more or less. This, once you recognize this one, you don't really recognize the next one necessarily. And these also cover a fairly broad range of time. So they go from a big chunk of the 18th century to a big chunk of the 19th century. But with all these complexities out of the way, for a decent price point, this is also a really, really cool kind of sword if you want to get into a bit the older style of things. So to recap, my 3 suggestions, starting from the lowest price point to kind of the highest, and always within the around 200 euro, dollars, pounds mark, are short, brass-hilted sidearms if you want to be able to dive into a vast field of research that really has a lot of variety and will enable you to learn a lot about a lot of different swords, a lot of different armies, and yeah, and something beefy and heavy. If you want something in the middle way, mid to late 19th century officer or NCO standard issues. These are also really cool. They have a lot of variants. They're a little bit pricier, but still definitely an amazing piece to start your collection with. On the higher end of our modest price range, small swords, these are less easy to identify often, require a little more understanding of the historical context, but they're honestly beautiful and very historical piece, and they would look great in any collection, of course. But if these 3 suggestions aren't enough for you and you want to have a broader range of options to choose from when you get your first sword, I also have 3 honorable mentions, I would say, of different typologies that you may want to look into when starting your collection. A caveat here is that for some of these, at least, the collector value is usually fairly low. They're not swords that are very sought after. They're not swords that are going to get you a huge bunch of compliments, oftentimes. It's more something that if you like, and some people do really like them, so there is a market for them, so I'll mention it just in case you're that person. First of these honorable mentions doesn't exactly fit the mold, but because they are actually swords with models and patterns and standards, the only thing is they're not usually military swords in the sense we consider them today to be. So in the 19th century, a lot of jobs or a lot of functions had uniforms, and a lot of these uniforms came with a sword. So you might have had postal workers with a sword. Judges may have had a sword as part of their, not everyday use, of course, but as part of their uniform. Diplomats may have had a specific sword for diplomatic purposes. I mentioned these in the honorable mentions because you can find certain models of these for really good prices, and sometimes they're really beautiful because as part of a fancy mid to high ranking uniform, they need to be nice. But they can also be really expensive. So it's a mid-honorable mention in the sense that it's not a guarantee that you go there and will find them for cheap. You need to know what you're looking at, but these can go for cheap if you're lucky, and they look really good. Moving on to instead the honorable mentions that are really outside of the traditional collector's mindset, I would say. You have Masonic swords or fraternity swords. Once you recognize them right away. They're sometimes richly decorated, and these can go for fairly decent prices. This is because I think most collectors look at more antiques or military issue kind of objects. In the US, I know there are a lot of them. Sometimes they're very cool because you may have the name, because these were like presentation swords. So you may have the name of who it was given to, the chapter of whatever association it was. So they are interesting, but they're a little, I would say, on the sidelines of collecting. Still, they can be 19th century swords. So, I mean, you can get antiques. They can be really beautiful. Don't swing them because they're not always made for battle. And the last one, and these I don't have, so I can't show you, unfortunately. The last one I'd like to show you, though, and I'll just throw this in because someone may be interested in them, are antique fencing swords. So, of course, here we're moving away from the military use, and these aren't meant to kill anyone. They're not weapons. So if you have if you want something with that kind of aggressive history, like this adventurous history, these may not be for you. However, they're a very, very cool way to get started with antiques. And for me, what's interesting about these is that they give you a very cheap way to start looking at antique metal. Perhaps you can start cleaning them without fear of damaging them. You can start looking at characteristics of how brass ages. You can look at, lots of times they have maker's marks. So for example, this one I think is Solingen blade, if I'm not mistaken. No, this is made in Brussels, by the way. So in these also you can find the 19th century fencing foils épées for 20, 30, 40, up to $50, pounds, euro, I would say. So these are really, really low barrier to entry. They still look really cool hanging on a wall, and they also give you the opportunity to actually touch and work on an antique without the fear of damaging a precious collectible. So that's it, I would say. You have my 3 main suggestions, which I feel like I can safely endorse as great options to start, and then you have 3 honorable mentions that, depending on your collecting style, may work for you or not. What do you think? If you're an experienced collector, please let me know if you see things differently, how you would do things, what you would suggest to beginners. And if you're a beginner and this video helps you buy your first sword, make sure to come back and let me know which one it was and how it went and if you're happy. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye.